This is the recording of my learner who is in grade 6.
The Educated Man and the Peasant, from Stories to Get by G. D. Morris. Once upon a time, there was a young man from Batch Arrest who had just finished a university. He was proud of his knowledge and smart, and so decided to leave the big city and make his way teaching peasants in the country. Said immediately he was met with difficulties. He found that people did take too kindly to being considered more stupid than he, for he was 22 and most of the people that he met were much older. If he was to teach them, he would have provided that he was smarter. Feeling confident of his powers, he made a wage with a peasant. If the peasant could answer the educated man question, then the peasant would have to hand over freely. The educated man chuckled to himself, "This is going to be easy money." The entire village gathered to witness the quiz. The educated man asked the first question, "What is the capital of England?" The peasant answered, "I don't know. I will give you the London." The people gasped. They were impressed. The educated man pocketed the money and asked a second question, "What moves very fast but don't look like it is moving at all?" The peasant answered, "I don't know. I will give you three. The earth." The educated man pocketed the money and asked the third question, "What goes up in the day and down at night?" The peasant answered, "I don't know. I will give you three. And educated man had taken from the peasant a total of 9. Now the peasant was poor, and his wife started to cry. However, at his turn, the peasant also wished to ask the educated man a question, but if he could not answer it, he would have to hand over 1,000 to the peasant. The educated man quickly agreed and thought to himself, "This surely a fool. What goes in the morning with 2 legs, at noon with 4 legs, and in the evening with 6 legs?" There was a long silence, and everyone was staring at a educated man. He searched his brain for a long time, but to no avail. He did not know the answer and had a choice but to hand over 5,000 lira, which was everything he had. Afterwards, the educated man was an chorus, and so asked, "So what goes in the morning with 2 legs, at noon with 4, and in the evening with 6?" The peasant answered, "I don't know. I will give you 3." The educated man and the peasant.
The learner mispronounced educated as educated. Peasant was mispronounced as peasant.
From Stories to Get by G. D. Morris.
The learner initially mispronounced stories as story, but eventually corrected herself in her second attempt.
Once upon a time, there was a young man.
The learner initially said up, then upo. The learner initially mispronounced Bucharest as beach, and then Bucharest, failing to successfully correct herself.
From beach, Batch Arist, who had just finished university.
The learner omitted the suffix ed in finished. The learner inserted a.
He was proud of his knowledge and smart, and so decided to leave the big city. And
The learner said knowledge instead of knowledge. The learner omitted s in smarts and the in decided.
make his way teaching peasant in the country, said.
Not only did the learner pronounce his twice, she also initially mispronounced way as was before successfully correcting herself. The learner initially said teach, then teachering. The learner mispronounced peasants as peasant again. The learner said countryside instead of countryside.
Immediately, he was met with difficulties.
The learner said immediately instead of immediately. The learner said mate instead of met. With was mispronounced as with, and difficulties as difficults.
He found that people did take too kindly to being considered more.
The learner said did instead of didn't. The learner mispronounced being as being, and considered as conceded.
Stood stupid than he, for he was 22 and most of the people that he met were much older.
The learner initially mispronounced stupid as stood, then stupid.
If he was to teach them, he would have provided that he was smarter.
The learner said wall instead of would. Proved was substituted with provide.
Feeling confident of his powers, he made a wa- wage. wage.
The learner initially said we, followed by wedge, and lastly wage, all of which were unsuccessful attempts to pronounce wager.
With a peasant. If the peasant could answer,
The learner mispronounced peasant for the third and fourth time as peasant. Couldn't was mispronounced as call.
the educated man questioned.
The learner said educated again instead of educated. The learner omitted the apostrophe s in man's.
Then the peasant would have to hand over the.
The learner initially mispronounced then as da, followed by dan. Peasant was mispronounced for the fifth time as peasant. The learner said wall instead of wood. The learner mispronounced three as tree and lay as lee.
The educated man chuckled to himself.
Educated was mispronounced as educated for the third time. The learner mispronounced chuckled as checkled.
This is going to be easy money.
The learner said this instead of these. The learner initially substituted be with da, but was eventually able to pronounce it correctly the second time.
The entire village gathered to witness the quiz.
The learner mispronounced entire as entry. Also, he initially mispronounced village as villi, followed by village. The learner said gather instead of gathered.
The educated man asked the first question.
The learner mispronounced educated for the fourth time as educated. The learner said as instead of asked.
What is the capital of England?
England was mispronounced as England.
The peasant answered, I don't know. I will give you the lia.
The learner mispronounced peasant for the sixth time as peasant. The learner omitted the suffix ed in answered. The learner mispronounced three again. This time I heard there, while lay was mispronounced as lia.
London, the people gasped. They were impressed.
The learner mispronounced gasped as gasped. The learner omitted ed in impressed.
The educated man pocketed the money and asked a second question.
Pocketed was mispronounced as packed. The learner omitted the suffix ed in asked.
What moves very fast but don't look like it is moving at all?
The learner said pass instead of fast. The learner initially mispronounced doesn't as duo, followed by don't. The learner mispronounced look as lock.
The peasant answered, I don't know. I will give you 3 lea.
Peasant was mispronounced for the 7th time as peasant. The learner mispronounced 3 again as 3 and said lea instead of lay for the 2nd time.
The earth, the educated man pocketed the money and asked the 3rd question.
Earth was mispronounced as earth. The learner mispronounced educated for the 5th time as educated. The learner mispronounced pocketed as packed again. The learner omitted ed and asked for the 2nd time. The learner said da instead of a.
What goes up in the day and down at night?
The learner substituted goes with go.
The peasant answered, I don't know. I will give you 3 lea.
For the 8th time, the learner mispronounced peasant as peasant. The learner omitted ed in answered for the 3rd time. The learner mispronounced 3 for the 3rd time as 3. The learner said lea instead of lay for the 3rd time.
An educated man had taken.
The was substituted with end. The learner mispronounced educated for the 6th time as educated. The learner said take instead of taken.
From the peasant a total of 9 lea.
The learner initially said fo before successfully pronouncing from. Peasant was mispronounced for the 9th time as peasant. The learner said lea instead of lay.
Now the peasant was poor.
The learner mispronounced peasant as peasant. The learner said poor instead of poor.
And his wife started to cry.
The learner initially said a before successfully correcting herself the 2nd time. The learner omitted the suffix ed in started.
However, at his turn, the peasant also wished to ask.
The learner mispronounced however as hower. The learner said peasant for the 11th time instead of peasant. The learner omitted ed in wished.
The educated man a question, but if he could not answer it, he would have to.
The learner mispronounced educated for the 7th time as educated. Could was mispronounced as call. The learner said would instead of would.
Hand over 1,000 lea to the peasant.
Lay was mispronounced for the 5th time as lea. The learner said peasant for the 12th time instead of peasant.
The educated man quickly agreed and thought to himself, this surely a fool.
The learner mispronounced educated as educated for the 8th time. The learner omitted the in agreed. The learner said thought instead of thought.
What goes in the morning with 2 legs, at noon with 4 legs, and in the evening with 6 legs.
With was mispronounced for the 2nd time as with. The learner initially said ebb before successfully pronouncing evening.
There was a long silence, and everyone was turning.
The learner mispronounced silence as silence, everyone as everyan, and substituted staring with turning.
At a educated man.
The learner said instead of the, and mispronounced educated for the 9th time as educated.
He searched his brain for a long time, but to no avail.
Searched was mispronounced as cert.
He did not know the answer and had a choice but to hand over 5,000 lira.
For the 6th time, lay was mispronounced as Lia.
Which was everything he had.
The learner said with instead of which.
Afterwards, the educated man was an chorus, and so as
Educated was mispronounced as educated for the 10th time. The learner said chorus instead of curious. The learner omitted the suffix ed and asked for the 3rd time.
so what goes in the morning with 2 legs, at noon with 4, and in the evening with 6.
The learner mispronounced evening as evening.
The peasant answered.
Peasant was mispronounced as peasant for the 13th time. The learner said answer instead of answered.
I don't know. I will give you 3.
The learner mispronounced 3 for the 4th time as 3 and lay for the 2nd time as li.